The dimly lit streets of Chicago's South Side had seen their fair share of struggle, and James Carter knew this reality all too well. Once a promising theater student, James had spent years chasing his dream of becoming an actor and playwright. But life had other plans. Bills piled up, auditions led nowhere, and reality forced him into bartending at a rundown jazz club just to survive. He poured drinks for customers who barely noticed him, except for the old-timers who listened when he recited Shakespeare monologues between shifts. One night, as he cleared the counter, a deep, unmistakable voice broke through the chatter. "Now that was real talent!" James looked up. Morgan Freeman stood before him. The legendary actor had been sitting in the corner, unnoticed, sipping a whiskey neat. His eyes carried the weight of experience, his presence commanding yet kind. "I know a storyteller when I see one," Morgan continued. "But tell me, son, why are you behind this bar instead of on a stage?" James hesitated. Should he be honest? Should he admit that he had given up? He sighed, wiping the counter. "I tried, but doors don't open for people like me." Morgan leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "Doors don't open on their own. Sometimes you gotta knock a little louder." James had no idea that this night would change everything. The next day, James went about his routine as usual. He never expected to see Morgan Freeman again. But just as he finished his shift, the club's manager called out, "You've got a visitor." James turned, and there he was. Morgan handed him a small, leather-bound book. "Read this," he said. James looked at the cover. The Art of Persistence in Storytelling. Confused, he asked, "Why are you giving me this?" Morgan smiled. "Because talent alone isn't enough. You need resilience. You have a voice, James, but what matters is what you do with it." James clutched the book, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. Inspired, James dusted off his old scripts and decided to give his dream one last shot. He sent his plays to small theaters in the city. He auditioned again, even when rejection seemed inevitable. He rehearsed monologues late into the night, picturing himself on stage instead of behind the bar. Weeks passed, no callbacks, no interest. Doubt crept in again. Was Morgan Freeman wrong? Was he just another dreamer chasing nothing? Then an email arrived. "Mr. Carter, we'd love to workshop your play. Let's talk." James's heart raced. It was a small theater, nothing major, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The workshop was brutal. Critics tore apart his script. Directors questioned his dialogue. Actors stumbled over his words. James felt humiliated. Maybe he wasn't meant for this after all. That night, frustrated, he called the only person who had believed in him. Morgan answered on the first ring. "So, you got your first real critique, huh?" James sighed. "They ripped my work apart." Morgan chuckled. "Good. Means they took it seriously." James frowned. "How is that good?" Morgan's voice softened. "Because if you weren't worth their time, they wouldn't have bothered. Great stories aren't born perfect. They're forged in the fire of doubt. The real question is, are you going to quit?" James sat in silence. He already knew the answer. Instead of quitting, James rewrote the script from the ground up. He took every note, every critique, every rejection, and turned it into fuel. The second time around, something clicked. Actors felt the depth of his words. Directors nodded in approval. Critics? They listened. His play, The Forgotten Voice, was accepted into Chicago's Independent Theater Festival. When the final curtain dropped on opening night, the audience stood in applause. James, standing in the wings, held back tears. And in the back row, watching silently, was Morgan Freeman. With success came expectations. Larger theaters wanted his work. Media outlets wanted interviews. Hollywood agents reached out. But James felt something was missing. Morgan, sensing his hesitation, invited him for a walk. As they strolled through the city, James confessed, "I'm grateful, but I don't want to lose my voice. I started this for the love of storytelling, not for fame." Morgan nodded. "Then don't let them change your story. Write what matters. Don't just chase applause. Chase truth." That night, James made a choice. He turned down commercial scripts. He stayed true to his raw, honest storytelling. He created stories that made people feel. And that was what set him apart. James never forgot where he came from. He started a program for young playwrights. He funded theater workshops for struggling artists. He visited community centers, teaching kids how to tell their own stories. Morgan sent him a note. "James, true success isn't about rising alone. It's about pulling others up with you. And you, my friend, have done just that." James smiled. He finally understood. Years later, James stood on stage at a major film festival. Looking at the crowd, he reflected on the night Morgan Freeman had walked into his bar. "A single conversation changed my life. But success isn't about luck. It's about what you do when someone hands you an opportunity. So if you ever get the chance, take it. And when you make it, don't just stand at the top. Reach down and pull someone else up. Because that's the only way stories truly live on." As the audience erupted into applause, James looked to the front row. Morgan Freeman was there, smiling. James had become more than a playwright. He had become a storyteller of change. And it had all started with one unexpected encounter. Years passed, and James Carter's name became a staple in the world of theater. His plays weren't just performed, they were felt. Audiences saw themselves in his words, in his struggles, in his relentless pursuit of truth. One evening, James stood in the grand foyer of the Chicago Theater, staring at a massive banner. James Carter's The Forgotten Voice, 10-year anniversary performance. It felt surreal. He had started in a rundown jazz club, his dreams buried beneath the weight of survival. Now, his words were reaching thousands. Before the performance, a familiar voice broke through the hum of conversation. "You did it, son." James turned to see Morgan Freeman, now older, his presence still commanding. James grinned. "I wouldn't be here without you." Morgan chuckled. "No, James, you wouldn't be here without you." They walked onto the empty stage, looking at the rows of seats slowly filling with eager spectators. James sighed. "I keep thinking about that night in the jazz club. You told me doors don't open on their own." Morgan nodded. "And you didn't just knock, James. You kicked the damn thing open." Silence settled between them, comfortable, filled with understanding. James hesitated before speaking. "Morgan, what do we do when we reach the top? When we finally get what we worked for?" Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice carrying years of wisdom. "We don't just tell our own stories, James. We make sure others get to tell theirs." James smiled. The house lights dimmed. The curtain rose. And another story began.